The median bank account balance in America is $8,000, not 80,000, 8. If you have more than that sitting in your checking or savings account right now, you are statistically wealthier than half the country. Let that sink in. Half of all American households have less than 8 grand to their name in liquid savings. And here's what's wild. The economy is supposedly doing great. The stock market hit record highs in 2025, unemployment is low, inflation has cooled, and yet, if you're watching this, there's a decent chance you feel like you're drowning financially. You're not crazy. The numbers tell a story the headlines don't. My name's James, and I've spent the last few months digging through Federal Reserve data, consumer finance reports, and national surveys that paint a picture of American wealth that will probably shock you. Because while the headlines scream about economic growth and rising wages, the numbers underneath tell a completely different story. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside the average American's bank account in 2026, and more importantly, where you stand in all of this. Here's the stat that should make your stomach drop. 67% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, 2/3 of the country. And before you assume that's just minimum wage workers barely scraping by, think again. This includes people making 6 figures, lawyers, engineers, mid-level managers, all trapped in the same cycle. They get paid, the money evaporates into rent or a mortgage, car payments, groceries that somehow cost double what they did 4 years ago, and by the time the next paycheck hits, they're back at zero. This isn't a poverty problem, it's a structural trap that's swallowing the middle class whole. But it gets darker. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans, 24% to be exact, have zero emergency savings. Nothing. No rainy day fund, no cushion. Nothing between them and financial catastrophe. If the car breaks down, if they get sick, if the water heater explodes, they're instantly in crisis mode. And it's not because they're reckless, it's because there's nothing left to save after covering the basics. Meanwhile, 54% of households have no dedicated retirement savings at all. None. They're not failing to plan for the future because they're irresponsible. They're failing to plan because they can't afford to survive the present. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, inflation. You've probably heard that inflation has come down, that things are getting better. Technically, that's true. The rate of increase has slowed. But here's what they don't tell you. The damage is already done. Prices for goods and services are roughly 25% higher today than they were in 2020. A 25% markup on everything. Groceries, insurance, rent, utilities. All of it costs a quarter more than it did just a few years ago. And wages didn't jump 25%. Most people maybe got a 10% raise if they were lucky. That gap between what things cost and what people earn has widened into a chasm, and nobody's building a bridge. The vibe is off, and people know it. 32% of Americans expect their personal finances to get worse in 2026. That's the highest level of financial pessimism recorded since 2018. Think about that. Despite all the good news on paper, 1/3 of the country is looking at the year ahead and thinking, I'm about to get crushed. They're not wrong. The split-screen economy is real. If you own assets, stocks, real estate, you probably had a great 2025. Your net worth went up on paper. But if you live off wages alone, if you're trading time for a paycheck and trying to make it stretch, you're statistically falling further behind. And here's the kicker. Americans were asked how much they'd need to feel wealthy in 2026. The answer, $2.5 million in net worth. Not retire and never work again money, just feel wealthy money. The number people say they need to retire comfortably has climbed to $1.26 million. Let that sink in. The average person believes they need over $1 million saved just to stop working without panicking. And yet, as you're about to see, the actual retirement savings of most Americans isn't even close, not in the same galaxy. So where do you actually stand? Because here's the thing, averages lie. When you hear that the average American has $91,000 saved for retirement at age 40, that sounds decent. But that number is skewed by people at the very top. The guy with $2 million saved drags the average up and makes everyone else look better than they are. What you really want is the median, the point where half the people are above and half are below, the real middle. Let's break it down by age, because this is where it gets uncomfortable. If you're under 25, the median retirement savings is about $2,800. That's not a typo. For people aged 25 to 34, it rises to around $15,000. Not enough to retire on, obviously, but at least it's a start. By ages 35 to 44, the median hits about $35,500. So if you're 40 years old with $40,000 saved, you might look at that $91,000 average and feel behind, but you're not. You're actually ahead of the median American. You're doing better than half the country. Things improve slightly with age. Ages 45 to 54, about $61,500. Ages 55 to 64, roughly $87,500. Ages 65 and older, around $88,500. Let me be very clear. $88,000 is not enough to retire on. At a 4% withdrawal rate, that's about $3,500 a year, or $291 a month. You can't live on that. Social Security helps, sure, but the average Social Security check is about $1,900 a month. Add that to your savings drawdown, and you're living on roughly $2,200 a month. That's tight, really tight. Now let's talk about debt, because savings are only half the equation. Debt is the anchor dragging everyone down, and it's distributed unevenly across generations. Gen Z, ages 18 to 28, carries an average debt load of about $34,000. That sounds manageable until you realize it's mostly student loans and car payments, and they're just starting their careers. Millennials, ages 29 to 44, are carrying around $132,000 in debt. Mortgages are the biggest driver, but also student loans that never seem to die, and credit cards filling the gap between income and expenses. But the real debt champions are Gen X. People aged 45 to 60 carry an average debt load of $158,000. They're the sandwich generation, paying for their kids' college, helping aging parents, trying to save for their own retirement that's approaching fast. They're getting squeezed from both ends, and the numbers prove it. Baby boomers, ages 61 to 79, still carry about $92,000 in debt. Lower than Gen X, but still significant for people who should be theoretically winding down. Many are still paying mortgages, many are still helping family financially, and it's eating into whatever retirement cushion they manage to build. And then there's credit card debt, the trap that never stops taking. The average credit card balance for people who carry debt is nearly $7,000. But here's the stat that should terrify you. 46% of credit card holders don't pay their bill in full every month. Nearly half the country is paying 20% interest or more on their balances. That's not debt, that's a tax on being broke. If you're carrying a $7,000 balance at 22% interest and only making minimum payments, you'll be paying that off for years, while the bank quietly collects thousands in interest. It's not an accident, it's designed to keep you stuck. So how do you compare? Are you ahead of the median or behind? Are you part of the 67% living paycheck to paycheck, or have you carved out some breathing room? The answer matters because understanding where you stand is the first step to changing it. And there's more to unpack here because the numbers get even more revealing when you zoom in on behavior. Let's talk about what people are actually doing with their money right now, because the patterns are fascinating and disturbing. It's not just about how much people have, it's about the choices they're forced to make under financial pressure. And those choices create a cascade effect that makes everything worse. Start with the savings rate. Americans are currently saving about 3.5% of their income. That's pathetically low.
The historical average is closer to 8%. Financial experts recommend at least 20% if you want to build real wealth. But at 3.5%, for every dollar you earn, you're keeping 3.5 cents. The rest evaporates into expenses, debt payments, and the black hole of daily living costs. This isn't laziness. This is people getting crushed by the math of modern life. Why is the savings rate so low? Because people are making a brutal choice: save for the future or survive the present. And survival is winning. When rent jumped 30% in 3 years, when groceries cost 25% more than they did in 2020, when car insurance somehow doubled for no obvious reason, there's no spare cash to sock away. You're not building wealth, you're plugging holes. Now let's talk about housing, because this is where the squeeze becomes impossible to ignore. If you're a renter, you're statistically screwed. Nearly 50% of renters reported difficulty paying rent in 2025. Not "it's tight," actual difficulty choosing between rent and other necessities. The median rent in America hit about $2,000 a month. If you're making the median household income of roughly $75,000, that rent eats 32% of your gross income. Financial advisors say you shouldn't spend more than 30% on housing. Most renters are already past that line before paying for anything else. Homeowners aren't exactly living in paradise either. If you bought a house in the last 3 years, you're probably locked into a mortgage rate between 6 and 8%, double what people were paying in 2020. A $400,000 mortgage at 7% costs about $2,660 a month in principal and interest alone. Add property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, and you're looking at $3,500 to $4,000 a month. For a household making $100,000, that's half your take-home pay going to one asset. But here's the twisted part. If you already own a home, especially one bought before 2020, your net worth probably looks fantastic on paper. Home values exploded. The stock market hit records. Your 401k statement looks great. But you can't eat equity. You can't pay the electric bill with unrealized gains. So you end up in this bizarre situation where someone's net worth is up $200,000, but they still feel broke because their monthly costs are strangling them. This is the split-screen economy. Turn on CNBC and you'll see headlines about the S&P 500 breaking records, unemployment staying low, GDP growth looking solid. Everything seems fine. Talk to real people and they'll tell you they're drowning. Both things are true at the same time. The economy is doing great. The people are not. Credit cards are filling the gap and it's turning into a disaster. Remember that $7,000 average balance? Let's run the math. At 22% interest, which is pretty normal now, and minimum payments of about $140 a month, it takes 94 months to pay off. That's almost 8 years. Over that time, you'll pay $6,160 in interest alone, nearly double what you borrowed. The credit card companies know this. They're counting on it. That's the business model. They make billions off people who are too broke to pay off balances, but desperate enough to keep charging. And it's getting worse because the psychology is vicious. When you're stressed about money, exhausted from working, trying to keep your kid in decent shoes and your car running, you stop tracking every purchase. You swipe the card and deal with it later. Later becomes next month. Next month becomes next year. Suddenly, you're one of the 46% carrying a balance, paying interest on pizza you ate 6 months ago. Debt also blocks smart financial moves. Say you're carrying $132,000 in debt like the average millennial. A big chunk is probably your mortgage. That's fine. That's leverage on an appreciating asset. But then there's $30,000 in student loans at 6%, a $500 car payment at 9%, and maybe $8,000 on credit cards at 20%. Uh-oh, your minimum debt payments alone are probably $2,500 a month. That's $30,000 a year going out the door just to service debt, not to build wealth, not to invest, just to not fall further behind. This is why people can't save. This is why emergency funds don't exist for most households. Every dollar that could go toward building a cushion is already spoken for. It's allocated to debt payments, inflated living costs, and the rising price of simply existing. You're not falling behind because you're irresponsible. You're falling behind because the system is extracting more from you than it used to, and your income hasn't kept pace.
The numbers prove it. Adjusted for inflation, wages have barely moved in the last 20 years for most workers, but costs have exploded. Healthcare, education, housing, childcare, the big, unavoidable expenses you can't just cut out of your budget. All of them have outpaced wage growth by massive margins. So even if you're making more money nominally than your parents did at your age, you're actually poorer in real terms. Your purchasing power has been shredded. This is why people feel gaslit when they hear how strong the economy is. If you're a homeowner who bought before 2020 and you've got money in the stock market, yeah, you probably had a great year. Your net worth went up. But if you're a renter trying to break into home ownership, where you're living off wages without significant investments, the economy isn't working for you. It's working against you. This is the tale of two economies playing out in real time. So where does that leave most people in 2026? Let's go back to the savings rate, because this number is genuinely alarming. The personal savings rate, how much of their income people are putting away, is hovering around 3.5%. That's pathetically low. Historically, Americans saved closer to 8 or 9%. During the pandemic, when stimulus checks hit and people couldn't spend on travel or restaurants, the savings rate briefly spiked above 30%. Now, we're back to barely saving anything. That 3.5% tells you everything you need to know. People aren't choosing to save less, they can't afford to save more. Every dollar is already allocated before it hits the bank account. Housing is the other massive pressure point squeezing people from both sides. If you're renting, you're getting destroyed. Nearly 50% of renters in 2025 reported difficulty paying rent, not struggling to save for a down payment, struggling to make rent at all. And if you're a homeowner, you might own the house, but you're locked in by your mortgage rate. If you bought when rates were 3%, you can't move now. Selling means financing a new place at 7%. You're trapped. Your house isn't an asset you can easily leverage. It's a golden cage. The wealth gap isn't just widening, it's turning into a chasm. People who own assets, who bought homes before prices exploded, who have retirement accounts invested in the market, they're doing fine, better than fine. Their net worth grew significantly in 2025. But if you don't own assets, if you're starting from zero trying to get a foothold, you're running uphill into a hurricane. The starting line keeps moving further away. Here's the part that really gets me. Those benchmark numbers we talked about earlier, the medians for retirement savings, the averages for debt, those aren't aspirational goals, they're survival metrics, and half the country isn't even hitting them. If you're 45 years old with $50,000 saved for retirement, you're ahead of the median, but you're still nowhere near what you actually need to retire comfortably. That $1.26 million Americans say they need to retire, at current savings rates, most people will never get close. The system isn't designed for you to win anymore. It's designed to extract. Credit card companies profit when you can't pay off your balance. Rent lords profit when housing eats 40% of your income. Employers profit when wages stay flat while productivity soars. You're not failing. You're being failed by a structure that prioritizes profit extraction over financial stability for working people. But here's what you can control. You can't fix the economy. You can't lower interest rates or make rent affordable. But you can stop measuring yourself against averages inflated by outliers. You can stop feeling behind just because a chart says you should have more. If you have anything saved, you're ahead of 24% of Americans who have nothing. If you're making progress on debt, even slowly, you're moving in the right direction. The landscape is harsh, but you are not powerless. Focus on the gap between what you earn and what you spend. That gap is your margin. That margin is your weapon. Even if it's small right now, that's what eventually becomes your emergency fund, your down payment, your escape hatch from paycheck to paycheck living. It won't happen overnight. It might take years, but the alternative is staying trapped in the cycle forever. And that's not an option. The numbers don't lie, but they also don't tell you what to do next. If you're realizing you're behind the median or way behind, don't spiral. The averages are broken. The system is extracting, but you are not powerless. Start small, track the gap, build the margin, and stop comparing yourself to people whose wealth came from timing and luck you didn't have. You're not racing them. You're fighting for your own stability. And that fight is worth winning.